just checking on the page staticgen.com. That's like a collection of all tools that allow you to generate static sites. Like this list is endless. There's like a bazillion tools out there right now. And they're all very efficient at generating static sites. So it's very nice to choose your right tools, the ones that you like. And there's always ones in your technology, if maybe not Vue, maybe it's like React or so, then you may be happier with Gatsby or something like this. So there's a ton of tools out there, what's exciting actually. I think the underlying question for me was, okay, how can it be that like static sites are so relevant and popular today? Like what has changed that actually we started historically with like static sites as one of the only ways of like expressing ourselves, like with building HTML pages? At least that's where I started. Like I had a, what was it called, like front page, Microsoft front page on my laptop or on my computer, and said, hey, I want to build something. I had no idea what or so, but like just putting together HTML, a little bit of CSS. Everything was like built individually. There was a lot of copy paste happening back then. But yeah, and suddenly a lot of things have changed, but now they're like super relevant again. And I think I personally was curious why this happened actually. And I tried to break it down. Like as said, we had like this basic websites, HTML and CSS, like they're still the basic tools that we use, but you were limited to a certain degree. As soon as you wanted to build something with like a little bit more functionality, you very soon approach a point where you need like a backend. Like if it's a simple form or whatever, like you always had a backend that was the thing that kind of brought the interactivity to your page. And over time, this kind of things like they merge together to a certain degree. Like if you think of tools like PHP, I really liked PHP once I discovered it. It just allowed you to give your pages like this extra interactivity, and like I don't want to see my old code, like probably looks very horrible, but like as the evolution, like these things start to bleed together to a certain degree. Like you were starting using PHP, for example, to render lists and repetitive data, and you kind of were generating a lot of those pages, but it was all driven by the backend eventually. But then at one point, like things move forward, history changes, technology advances a lot. JavaScript became more and more kind of interesting and appealing again, and eventually, like these things start to split up again, especially with the rise of like single-page applications. Suddenly you say, hey, like I have all these awesome JavaScript tools out there right now, like React, Vue, all these kind of things. And I don't want to have like the whole backend code, like kind of changing my rendering layer. Like I want to have full control over everything that was going on. So that was quite interesting actually. And I think this was very much one of the big breaking points where I say, suddenly I can use like all like JSON format, like we heard a lot about JSON today, what was very exciting. But you suddenly have another way of communicating to the backend in very different ways. And suddenly, also the backend became way more important and became replaced by this whole like serverless thing I talk about. If we look at serverless, what this means for us is like just really a collection of different services that we can use. And I think there's like just a bunch of like parts of serverless infrastructure. If we talk about it, it's like we can build like, or we have complete systems for shops, we have databases, we have like these Lambda functions. There's a lot of things happening right now where we say we don't need like this tight coupling to the client anymore. And the cool thing is we suddenly were able like to use this kind of thing with static sites as well, because performance is also still a thing, and nothing is faster than like a simple static site basically. Come in, welcome, find your seats. Yeah. And the thing that kind of clicked very much with me was like the term Jamstack. Like who has heard of the Jamstack? Not as many people? Ah, that's good, a few over there. So the Jamstack is like standing for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And for me, it was the first time I heard about it like, I would say like 2.5, 3 years ago maybe. Especially like the company Netlify, you probably maybe have heard of. For me, this was one of the companies really pushing this topic, like really hard, saying, hey, we do static sites. We really kind of help you to build some infrastructure around it on the back end, give you services or so, but it's all driven by your static sites and just simple usage of APIs. The first big use case it sounded what was incredibly interesting was like Smashing Magazine. I guess there are a bunch of people like reading Smashing Magazine. They made the complete transition from one of the biggest WordPress pages ever to transition completely over to being statically generated. And their page, like, it feels incredibly amazing, and you were able like to follow their journey. They did a lot of blog posts around it and a good of use cases. And it was just super exciting to see what you can build actually with like this new way of like building your static sites. And everybody likes Jam, so it's a good and catchy name. By the way, another random fact, if you bang your head against like a wall for 1 hour, you burn like 150 calories. And honestly, I banged my head against the wall a lot when I started working with like a lot of these new APIs and serverless technology, so it's very fitting to know how much energy I burned. Cool, but now let's build some stuff. We're all here to see how to kick ass with static sites, right? So I think the starting point should always be, if you build something, always start with the content. And just like this big saying, content is king, and I think it's true up to the date. If you don't have like your content, then it's very hard to build things around it. And also like if you build static sites for whoever, like for your customers, for yourself or whatever, like you always need to know what is the content that you're going to build this page for. Yeah, more people, that's exciting. And this content like this can come from very different sources. If you look like, it can be like just simple images. This can be like markdown files if you want to use markdown. I use for my blog, for example. But it can also that you use like one of the headless CMS solutions out there, and it can be like completely out of your like own system, but you use another service to manage all the content. So there's a bazillion different ways and puzzle pieces that you actually want to use or need or so to build together your page. For example, I have built a page for one client. They're super bad at like any kind of like technical things. Like they just want to use and kind of maintain the website, but they don't really have this like understanding or feeling for like all these technical challenges. And especially they don't update their page on a regular basis. It's more like a lot of updates accumulate, and then after like 2 months, you want to do update again. And they had always a very hard time with like any kind of like other maintaining system, like even WordPress. Like, okay, what am I doing? Why is this page breaking or so? It seems very trivial to us, but for these people or so, it's not always as trivial as we had thought. So for them, for example, it works perfectly well that they have a drag and drop folder where they just kind of drop in their text files and images or so. And those are the things that we can use actually to generate our static sites and make it like super easy and comfortable and take them by the hand, pick them up where they are, and build what they want to do. Once we have all this content together, basically, that's the point when we can start thinking about like the layout, what do we want to build, and how we want to do it. Like this is the thing that gets exciting for us when we can think about the technology, what we're using underneath. That can be Tailwind, can be Nuxt, can be Vue. That's a stack I really, really like by now. But of course, you can choose the other tools that you personally like. But that's the one where we can really express ourselves and play around with tools, use new things. That's pretty exciting. And eventually, we want to build and deploy everything after everything is built. And there's also, like I said, Netlify. If you haven't checked it out for static sites, it's incredibly good. But Nuxt is like also in this case where we're looking at a very handy tool to just generate everything out of the box. So the first big question we're going to dive into a little bit is the step from content to layout. That's a big question mark, like how do you get it from A to B? And as said, like there can be like a drag and drop folder, whatever. So there's like some layer of customization we can put in there. So that's nice. And what I really like to build is like using with Node. And I call this process of getting it from A to B the pipeline, basically, to throw everything in, and the pipeline shifts it over to something and where I can eventually use it and build the other part of my application with it. So yeah, what I do, I take this content and I put it together into a graph.json. What's very fitting, because Douglas talked a lot about JSON, and I'm very happy for this format, because you can throw whatever you want in there, and it's quite handy, and it's not breaking. And even JSON is not great with graphs, but more trees. I call it graph.json because it's like, it seemed fitting actually to have like a summary of all the things that I have in my folder to build the content. Yeah, and one thing that worked really well for me is like just, okay, putting together some like nice node scripts. And there's like the tools I want to put together is, for example, what I need is the path and the file system, because I really want to pick it up where it is right now. And one thing I can't emphasize enough, what's really, really cool, is about the file system key from Node. I think with Node 8, they introduced the promises option on this one, where you get like an alternate API to the whole file system. And in this case, you get a full promise support, so you can start to use the whole async await process, and this makes your code so much nicer. The downside is, I guess, like Node always says, it's in beta, not sure if anything is breaking, so potentially it's like not officially supported, but so far I didn't have any problems. And as I'm not using it in production, but like in the generation phase, I feel pretty safe and secure with this one. But that's the thing I can totally recommend to check out. And how this could look like and how you could build it, for example, is say, okay, I like to structure my code in like a very imperative way. We say, okay, what's the path? But it's basically where I find all the locations of the things, where I want to put something out and this kind of stuff. And for example, we want to process the markdown files, because I use markdown, as said, for my blog, for example. So here we see the first cool use case of the file system. That's where we can already await actually for the file system to read this folder. If you used like the file system before, there's a lot of this venable promises where it had like there's a lot of callback functions, and after like 4 file system calls or so, your code was super unreadable because it was a very deeply nested and complex at one point. Like the async await makes it so smooth and easy to read and write. That's very, very handy. The next one is afterwards we can just like return whatever like we want to do with our files. And the good thing is here, JavaScript provides the reducers. And I really came to really like reducers because they're incredibly powerful. And they work super well with async code, basically. So you can even await for a reducer to run through a lot of processes. So let's look at one of those reducers, how it could look like, right? The most critical part is, as we want to have it async await or so, you need to kind of use a promise for your accumulator to wrap it always in a promise, so it always resolves. And then your reducer is always waiting actually for the previous function to have resolved, and then it kind of goes on. That's the only little gotcha, and we'll see it afterwards how to call it. But that's quite easy, right? And then we just kind of pattern through all the files. And here, what worked pretty well, always a wait a set for the previous call. What's the file system, maybe? And here we say, okay, give me maybe the file name. Then we want to have the file stream. And Node working with files is always like returning streams. In this case, we really want to wait till the stream is finished to kind of continue from there. And that's actually the part where I then take, okay, this whole red markdown file, and I don't pass the markdown in this case, but for example, I pull out the front meta part and structure it back into the content. And there are configuration values, and now it's time for a dramatic drinking pause. All right. So, and then we're there at the accumulator where we just like put it all together and return it right away. If we put it all together, this is how it could look like for you. And we still see it's like very easy to read and digest actually what's going on, even if we do a lot of processes at once. The critical part, as said, is here our reducer. We now call it like with a promise resolve, and like this empty object is our starting value. So we need to give it a promise upfront to kind of work properly. But that's a small price to pay for having a fully async kind of reducer function running, right? And always try to wrap your code into a try-catch clause or so. It's like really makes your code a little bit more resilient, and you don't always know what is breaking, what's quite helpful. If you want to work with images, there's a super similar process you can do. It's like all working off the kind of same kind of schema. The library that I can recommend here is, for example, Sharp. Sharp allows you to do everything with images that you want. For example, here we just list through all the files, we pick out all the images, by their extension maybe. And then we pass it on to our resize and save function. That's where we're going to use sharp eventually. And this is how the function could look like, where we can even say we have different sizes, like we want to filter them, kind of cut them down, create some thumbnails, whatever we want to do with it. Like we can kind of write our code, go through all the files, and again, use this async await operations to even have sharp write the file, put it back where it belongs, and so. And all our code is like still running like super nicely and easy to read, and we don't have to care about all these standable promises by then. It's super nice. Cool. And as a short example, how this would look like, for example, if I have a cat.jpg, it would just go ahead and create a def.cat and def_cat and small_cat. And yeah, that's how easy it is actually to manipulate images, or so. It's quite nice. The important part then is, of course, whatever I want to do, eventually you want to write my graph file that kind of gives me all the information in one place, because that's the source of truth that I want to use for generating actually all the content. As we've seen, it's super easy to wait with like this asynchronous code. Of course, this could also say we reach out to an external API up front and call any information from another server, bake this into our graph JSON that we then use. This just makes it very, very handy, whatever we want to do. And the way that I kind of do it, I kind of describe what I want to have. I put the graph together as an object, and then just write it really in a proper JSON file. And the JSON stringify command, what I really like, if you pass in like this other 2 parameters and 4 at the end, for example, you define the spacing, and then you get a nicely indented JSON file that can also read, what's quite handy. Cool, but that's the graph file and pipeline process so far. Putting it all together in one file, it would potentially look like this. You can, of course, split it up in different files or so. Like, the freedom is endless. It's up to you. But this is the line of code that kind of kicks it off eventually, and then we write our graph file, and it's all good. To execute it, there's not more for us to do than just say, Node, okay, run this command. And yay, we have our graph file ideally lying in our static folder. And now we can jump into the next chapter of our journey to kick some ass, right? At this point, I have to say, like, automation of these kind of things is like really the absolute key ingredient or so. And I love automation, like automating these kind of things, how to generate it. Even if I want to create like a new blog post, for example, I have a small script that kind of puts this markdown file in place with all configuration values, and maybe even asks me like a few questions about the title, and if there's like an image on Unsplash that I want to use, and so I can just paste it in, it's all working, and I don't run into the issue that I suddenly forgot something, because like this will always like protect me to a certain degree, what's very, very handy. So I can always like encourage you, like automate as many things as possible, because at least I have a big scatterbrain and I constantly forget things if I don't automate them. Yeah, and let's add some Nuxt to the mix or so, because so far we just have a JSON file that tells us, okay, this is information that we want to generate, right? So let's put Nuxt in the mix to say this is our framework of choice to actually generate the whole page and application. That's quite easy to do, luckily. There's a quick start available. You can use npx command and then just say create Nuxt app and put in your folder, project name, whatever. And it just will kind of run the whole installation process of Nuxt for you, and will kind of scaffold the project. It's quite nice. The process looks something like this, where you get asked a few questions. And as said, again, like Nuxt is like just a framework on top of Vue, so just tries to kind of like guide you and kind of help you to kickstart the project. It's not very opinionated about what tools you're going to use with it along, but you can choose a lot of these kind of things. For example, here I'm going to use, I personally like Tailwind as said, so that's what you can use. You can also use like one of the backend frameworks if that's what should drive your application. So it asks you like about the most common ones, of course, but you can also go with like a simple Nuxt application. That's what we're going to do eventually, because it's like just working out of the box for what we want to build eventually. Yeah, and that's the critical part. If we want to build like a static site, you want to use the universal mode, not the single page application mode. That's like just a little key in how Nuxt is like changing out generating certain things. So the universal mode in this case is the right one we want to choose for static sites. And eventually you end up with a folder that looks something like this, where you have like a bunch of files in there and a bunch of folders, and this is like how a default Nuxt project looks like. And we're going to look at a few of those folders in detail. But the nice thing is, like, so far everything works just like super smooth. And if you kind of like call Nuxt dev or so, then we'll just like boot up the application for you, and suddenly you have like completely Vue server environment or so where you can build whatever you want to do. It's just working. This is like the first screen you're greeted with, where the Nuxt is like compiling everything. It has hot reload. It has everything in place that you want or so. It's just very, very nice and easy. Even as a playground, if you just say, okay, when I kickstart something, I want to try something out, it's like working super, super smooth. Can very much recommend. And the critical part for Nuxt is the nuxt.config.js. Like, this is mainly the only thing we really need to interact with on a default basis. There's a bunch of options in there what you can put in, like you can define your links, like any kind of meta tags that you want to use per page. You can also like change them from within like different pages. But that's the kind of main config structure where I say this is how I want to configure certain things. But so far we don't do anything with this file, so we can look at this at a little bit later. Let's jump right into Vue. Who here is familiar with Vue? Quite a lot. That's exciting. That's super awesome. So for the ones who are not or so, like Nuxt is using Vue single file components for everything. If you have never heard of Vue single file components, they're just like, think of whatever puts a component out. There's like some markup there. There's probably the script with the logic and maybe some styling. And single file components just like wrap it up nicely for you into one simple file. Very nice to kind of like keep everything clean, separated, and in a nice order and structure. And yeah, Nuxt uses those single file components across the board everywhere. And that's quite handy. So this is just what the upcoming code will look like, template and script. And so this is all mostly living in one page or one document even or so. I just sometimes split it up a little bit for the slides to be a little bit more readable. But that's it. Regarding the folders, where do those Vue files live? There's the layouts folder. That's usually the thing where you just have your general layout, a good place for navigation, footer, whatever like makes your page kind of pop or kick ass. Yeah, and then you have a pages folder, and that's a pretty interesting one because this is like your general page structure. And here Nuxt chooses the way you can really dictate how the structure looks like by using folders and files, and Nuxt will always automatically render them in this structure. So it's like really a one-on-one representation how the file will eventually look like. And then you have a folder for components, and these are all your reusable and shared Vue components that across the board you're going to use eventually. Let's jump right into our layout file, and this is how it could look like. Here we have our template and our style underneath, and this is a very general layout one. As you see, this is a little bit hard to read, but I just want to give you a short glimpse of how it would look like if you have worked with Tailwind. Did anybody here work with Tailwind so far? A few hands, it's awesome. I really love Tailwind. If you haven't given it a try or so, I totally recommend to give it a shot. It's a utility class-driven CSS framework, or maybe not a framework, it's more a library, but also it allows you to build really cool applications in no time. And the builder like Adam Wathan, he has a lot of good YouTube channels where he builds a lot of like complex UIs, and like it's so crazy easy. I'm very bad at explaining it, but it's like just so awesome. But this is how it looks like, but I'm going to kind of cut it out of the presentation because it's a little bit annoying to read. So in this case, this is how the general structure would look like, and this is your layout file maybe. And the important part is down here. It's this Nuxt section. This is basically the part where then Nuxt kind of goes in and says, okay, whatever I need to render, this is where I put it in. So this is how your templates in general work. And I mostly just use one template to kind of build everything out. But yeah, it's up to you. Let's look at our first page, how it would look like, could look like. This is our default landing page, I would call. As said, we use the folder structure. So it lives in page as index. You will see the folder written up there on the top. And the template is as simple as this, where say whatever you want to put into your layout in your default landing page. You can already use like components, like here use one for the post basically, or for previous posts. And my script underneath or so, that's the one kind of bootstrapping all this together. and there's not much more to it. Like this is how simple you can like put things together. And here we make actually use of our graph file that we have generated. Like here we say, okay, I care for the mon post with like super awesome images, and my graph file I just like required. Nuxt will say, okay, it's a JSON file. You might need to install like one extension. Just say Nuxt JSON import, I think. But then you're good to go, and suddenly you can work with like those JSON files out of the box, what's quite handy. And for example, have a utility for the recent post or the latest post or whatever. And this is how I pass it down to the data structure of Vue and say, those are my kind of key values, use this. And then suddenly I'm already in like the component land and can build all these kind of things together. And this is also the structure why it like works so well with like things like Tailwind, because you already start to wrap everything into components. So it's like easier to just write it once in a component place anyway. And that's quite handy. And as I said, like here, the composition is still key. I think if you end up yourself or so like just on the static sites copy and pasting a lot of content or say, oh, I'm duplicating this here and here and here, then that's usually a good indicator that something is off. So always try to kind of wrap something in a component if you want to use it like at least twice or so. Or sometimes it's just like nicer to wrap it in a component because it's easier and nicer to work with, to keep scope of where you are right now and what you're doing. So I would totally recommend to kind of like follow good composition patterns there, and there's a lot of good practices on the Vue default documentation about this. So, for example, let's look at the components post.vue file, right? This is our first component. Aslet lives in the components folder, so we want to reuse it. And this is actually the one where we're then going to use like our markdown file. So we import the MD from markdown.js. There's also one for dancing cats. If you wonder what dancing cats is, it's an incredibly horrible book. I saw it once, I stumbled over it on Amazon. I kind of like, it haunts my dreams. It's like, Google it. There's a lot of weird pictures of people like dancing in weird poses with cats or so. Now you know it exists. Enjoy the rest of your life. And then there's also like, for example, a clapper component that I built on my blog. It's, for example, something that uses like a lot of serverless work with some Lambda functions or so. But just kind of build what you want to do eventually, kind of to express yourself or build the blog the way you want. So what I do, for example, what I like to do with the post that's like generated from our graph file, that's the thing that I get as a property down to Vue. I just spread it into my kind of data object, and then I have access to like all the ones like title, slug, logs, whatever I want to put in there. It's quite handy. The template could look something like this, where we just like put everything together, like say, okay, this is how it should all feel and behave. Compose it, there's our dancing cats, advertising at the top. Then we have our Nuxt link. We're going to look at this in a second, but that's the important part. How can I link between different pages inside Nuxt? For example, here it's important for us to have a slug, but yeah, more to this in 1 second. The other part that I can recommend to check is like, Nuxt comes by default with ESLint enabled and a lot of really strict ESLint rules. If you don't use ESLint, I can also very much recommend to put it to your project. It just helps to kind of spot some easy mistakes and helps to keep your code clean. It also works pretty well with prettier in combination or so they go hand in hand, what's nice. If you end up using like Markdown and render like an HTML out of the box, Nuxt will very much complain at you. You should not use the vHTML attribute. The vHTML attribute, if you don't know, it's like really the one where throw HTML at it, Vue takes it and renders the HTML straight onto the page. Potentially always in security risk, of course. If somebody injects like any kind of malicious code, scripts or whatever, that could be the error. And that's why by default, it always warns you to not use the vHTML attribute. But you can just disable it very easily with these commands inside the template, and the Vue single files support it that you use ESLint in the script text or in the template directly. So it's always like really in place where you need it and want it. It's quite nice. Cool. We talked briefly about styling. There's also something I want to add to styling. For example, if you render HTML, you cannot use Tailwind right out of the box, for example. But you could do something like this, where say, wherever my HTML is living, I put in a style tag, and I can still make use of all the Tailwind classes. The add apply is a method that Tailwind brings along, and it just kind of applies the right utility classes for you to this component. And that's a very simple way, for example, how to structure complete markdown rendered HTML with very easy ways to have like some kind of readability, that have spacing between kind of paragraphs, and that's quite handy. Cool. We said we'll look at the Nuxt link thing. So there's one project in Vue, and Vue has like a pretty rich ecosystem by now. And one thing is, for example, Vue Router, to allow you to kind of to route between different pages if you want to build a full single page application. The Vue Router is integrated into Nuxt as a component. But what it does underneath or so, it kind of wraps it in an extra component where Nuxt does like some extra magic that it needs in order to be able to generate things or like a link between like your SPAs and stores, do a lot of things for you that Nuxt kind of provides out of the box. And yeah, you kind of say like Nuxt link, and we set the paragraph, and we basically use the Vue Router just with the extra layers. But this is how easy you can link between different pages. And in this case, we tell it, okay, for slug, render this page. So for example, we have a post and we have another post, and what I definitely do not want to do is like generate an extra file for each of those posts, like a Vue file, right? It should be automatically generated. So the simple trick to do this is you kind of mimic the structure inside your pages folder. In this case, there's a P folder as well. Like always use like 1 letters for small links or directories. In this case, P for page, basically. And then you just create one file. It's called like underscore whatever.vue. And this underscore is the thing that kind of tells Nuxt, okay, oh, that's a special page or so that kind of should kind of catch all links to a certain directory if there's no other page defined. If you create another one that's called like p/about.vue, and you always call it about, then it will always kind of prioritize this, of course. But everything else, like this is your catch-all area that says, say, okay, whatever comes, I'll try to render it on this page now. This is how the slug page itself could look like. Again, we have a very short template. We reuse the component that we made already, our post. We just paste in the same post. And the interesting part in this case is, okay, we want to pick the real post by the slug to say, okay, from all the files that I have in my graph file, just use the right one based on a certain attribute, and we can pick it down here from the routes params. There's like just the slug is got pasted directly onto our route params. And this is very, very handy to say, okay, what I want to grab or so, I want to kind of render what's there. And yeah, that's the way to do it. So now we can actually render individual pages for very different posts. That's great, right? The thing is, how can we generate them as well? This was one of my early mistakes, actually, when I thought, okay, I used the generate method of Nuxt or so when I build it. You need to tell Nuxt certainly about those routes, otherwise, like, they might not be there. The thing is, like, these Nuxt links will always work if you land on your index file. And if you click on a link, like Nuxt says, okay, I know what to do and what to load. But you need to tell it explicitly, hey, please, this should be a real static site. So how can I generate them? That's where, first of all, this command comes in handy. So this is the Nuxt generate one, what actually kicks off this whole static site generation process. That's like just hidden in the package JSON behind the run command generate. And usually I always recommend to use like any kind of like package JSON, your personal run commands, even if it's like easier sometimes to call it, but it gives you a little bit more flexibility. For example, we want to make sure that we always generate the latest graph file before we actually kind of generate the page. That's very handy if you want to deploy it somewhere and have like a build step, something. For example, I do not like to kind of check into my Git repository all the kind of changed images and like all the past markdown files and the graph JSON. I want to keep it out. I want to keep my Git repository super clean and my project very clean. So I always generate it freshly, basically. And this is how you can guarantee that's there. And you just hide it behind the generate command, and then it's like still as simple as this. And we use the whole async operation, so we're in good hands, basically. So now, how can we tell Nuxt about rendering those specific slug pages as well? Here you see a short taste of how a configuration could look like. As said, there's a place for some meta tags, for some links. In this case, the link is like real link to maybe global style sheets or whatever it is or so that you want to link to. Yeah, that's how you can configure it. Everything so far is very optional, I would say. Like by now, we didn't do anything in our application. It's like still building, running, and everything. So now it's the first time where we say we want to dive into Nuxt a little bit itself, or so, and tell you, okay, you need to generate some extra routes. And there's this generate key. It's like down at the bottom of the screen. And this one say, okay, also generate this specific routes. And again, we make use of our graph JSON. And that's why I said it makes a lot of sense to prepare your content up front. Because it seemed like we kind of use the same kind of structure over and over again on all different pages. And I don't want to always call a function to say, okay, generate now this kind of data for me. I only want to generate it once and go from there. This might be like complex as your page is complex, like come up with it or so, but this is your graph JSON. It's like this one kind of fine print of saying this is how it looks like, and then I can go from there. In this case, we just pass to the routes our custom routes and tell, okay, there's one for our post and one for our other post. Those are the ones you should definitely render, and then Nuxt will absolutely do this for you and put it in the right spot. Also, another interesting fact, Cynosilicophobia is the fear of an empty beer glass. Luckily, there's a good after party, and I was assured there's enough beer today, so please come abruptly, and I hope nobody suffers of this dramatic disease. But yeah, that should be fun. At this point, I just want to say, like, what we've done here so far is like just a simple start to say, okay, oh, I kind of put together a few parts. The thing is, what I wanted to show you is like how easy it becomes or so to kind of build like really your personal flavor kind of page or so, just go wild. Like as you've seen with Node, we can do a ton of different preparation work, scripts and automation to just kind of go from there, build whatever we want to build eventually. And yeah, that's just the start of what you eventually can do. And what I would encourage everybody, go back, like let's take the back the web a little bit or so, build more personal pages. There's a few things that concern me. For example, I see a lot of people like blogging on Medium. Medium, it's great itself, but like realistically, they still don't make a lot of like revenue. And I'm not sure what happens then to the pages if it go down. Like what does happen to all the amazing content that each and every one of you is creating? And I think we lost a little bit of track of this. And I think this whole static site generation, how we build it or so, is like also one step in this direction that people are willing to kind of take back more control of what we're doing, kind of get creative, and still don't let all the cool technically advancements we got or so behind us. And that's super exciting. With this, I say thank you for listening.